In this, the latest of our Erasmus Forum podcast, I come to the Castled Arts Gallery in Mayfair to talk to Bob Moran, who's one of the most original, creative and gifted of our contemporary artists, not just in Britain, but worldwide, it seems now. It's a good time to be a caricaturist, as he has found. There's something in the air and something in the atmosphere of our politics that creates great art and great caricature. Bob Moran, welcome to the latest in our Erasmus Forum podcasts, and this week we are going to be discussing your art, the art of the political caricaturist in the cartoon. There's a long history to this now, especially in Britain. Gilray, a very distinguished predecessor of yours at the beginning of the 19th century, said that it was really his role to defend Britain against Napoleon. And the Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt, actually put him on the public payroll because he thought he was not just such a good chap, but really a great influence of public opinion here and in France. And when Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, he said rather mournfully that the effect of Gilray's cartoons had been greater on his public reputation and his military career than 12 British generals. So the political caricaturist is a powerful person, is a powerful figure. Are you aware of the impact that you have?
I am now. It's interesting because I wasn't when I was younger. I very much as a young man approached this in total ignorance of the history and the tradition. And you're right, we have an incredibly rich tradition in this country of political satire, and perhaps we invented it. People say Gilray was the father of the political cartoon, and perhaps Hogarth was the grandfather. And but I just always drew cartoons from a young age, and I liked making people laugh. It wasn't until I was actually a lot older that I understood this rich tradition that we have. And of course, it's true, it's a very powerful medium. It's probably, in some ways, the most effective non-violent form of resistance we have against figures in authority. You know, when it came along, I think a lot of people thought, well, we can put down our pitchforks and torches now because they really don't like these images. And it very much came out of the gates at a gallop, political cartooning. Those early pioneers like Gilray are incredibly savage compared to what you see today.
I mean, today's cartoons and caricatures can be really quite gentle compared to the fury of the Georgian mob and the crowds of England at that time.
Exactly. And it's interesting the way it began with Gilray, for example, where, you know, the prints would be displayed in a window, and a crowd would gather to see the latest work, almost like watching a public hanging. And then they would be distributed almost underground as something unsolicited and dangerous. And it's interesting for me because that's how my work is shared nowadays, you know. And
I've been watching the faces of the people who've been coming through to the gallery, many of them seeing your images, your caricatures for the first time, and some of them looking genuinely shocked by what they see. And then they laugh.
Yes, and I hadn't anticipated that necessarily because obviously I have a very large and loyal following of people.
And the following is increasingly international.
Yes, which obviously affects the kind of work I produce. So it's actually quite unusual for me now to focus on British politics because I'm aware I have this global audience. So obviously I knew a lot of my long-term fans were going to come along and they'd be familiar with the work, but what's been interesting is lots of people just passing by have spotted the pictures in the window and they've been curious and come in, and that's wonderful actually, watching somebody who doesn't know who I am, hasn't seen the work before, going around and reacting, at first in shock and then laughing.
Now let's just think about what a caricature actually is. I mean,
Yes.
in some works of art, the great aim is very small, as the Italians would put it, is truth to life.
Yes.
And that comes out of the portraiture of the Renaissance, which no longer used the ideal of conformity to an ideal type, as it were, the ideal statesman, the ideal artist, perhaps the ideal soldier. And then we have the discovery of individuality in the Renaissance, and then the kind of truth that comes out of Donatello or Michelangelo is somebody looks at it and says, this looks just like the person I know, or even it looks just like me, if the artist has been commissioned by the patron to do so. But a caricature has a different impact, doesn't it? I mean, it perhaps you can explain how you set about the whole business of the character, because a caricature has to convey its own truth, but it's not truth to life, is it?
It's a different kind of truth that you're trying to get to with a caricature. So it very obviously does not look exactly like the subject, and it often involves exaggerating certain features, which the cartoonist can choose which ones to stretch and distort. But in some ways, what you want to accomplish is almost creating a character that is instantly recognizable, perhaps more recognizable even than a traditional portrait or photograph.
So the viewer seeing it for the first time would think, this is obviously the Prime Minister. And I've never thought of the Prime Minister in that way before. As we have with this very fine graphic example of your art, Miliband and Starman.
Yes.
Now they're immediately recognisable, but there's a truth that's being conveyed out of it, isn't there?
You're trying to convey an essence of the character, pick up on things people associate with them. You almost want to someone to look at a caricature and they can hear the person's voice and they can sort of instantly think of some of the ridiculous things they might have said. And I found this when I was working at the newspaper. When you draw the same politician for a long time, like for example, David Cameron, I drew for years, you first of all you work out how to caricature that politician and develop your own. It's very important to develop your own way of drawing them, because cartoonists will have slightly different versions. But then they almost become your own character. So I'm drawing David Cameron, but then it's separately I have my own David Cameron character who does certain things. You can develop certain themes.
Some cartoonists, some caricaturists have found David Cameron very difficult to draw.
He was quite difficult to draw.
The smoothness of the appearance, the
Yes.
smoothness of the skin.
Yes.
Sometimes slightly porcine, perhaps.
Yes, I mean, he had a face like a baby's bottom, really, I suppose, and very slick hair, and he was quite challenging. And also, it was difficult, that era, which was when I began at the Telegraph, the coalition era. It was quite dull, actually, I mean, compared to recent times. And Nick Clegg, again, very difficult to draw. Quite a plain, boring-looking chap.
But Tony Blair, a gift to the cartoonist, surely.
Tony Blair was actually the first politician I ever drew.
I mean,
When I was about
example
14.
in the gallery. It's called, what's it called? It's called facial recognition.
Yes.
And there seem to be dozens of tiny little Tony Blairs running all over. Would you like to explain what's going on there?
That piece was actually inspired by Hogarth's The Times. I don't know if you know the image of this very, very detailed scene of chaos with buildings on fire and all these different characters, and I thought I'd like to do something like that. It was the summer of all the riots with clashing groups, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, which of course I can see a character like Tony Blair behind these divisions, rubbing his hands together, thinking this is how we can bring in more control and digital IDs and things. He's just everywhere, isn't he? And he never goes away.
Yes.
He really lingers.
He comes back.
He really keeps coming back. And the other reason for that picture was I was compiling my book of all my work from the last 4 years, and I suddenly realised in horror that I'd hardly drawn Tony Blair at all. So I thought I'm going to put him in the same picture about 65 times to make up for it. Yes, so every single character is Tony Blair, but he's playing different roles. So there are police officers, there are pro-Palestine, pro-Israel people, football hooligans. There's an old lady that's Tony Blair. There's even a little bluebird in a nest that's got Blair's face. Yes.
You're a very independent-minded artist. I think practically every real artist has to be independent-minded and very often going against the grain. There's lots against, there are many images here that are, as it were, anti what some people would call right-wing, and there are many images that are anti the left. There's no continuous political strand here, is there?
No.
It's just a rejection of authoritarianism, wherever we find it.
It's a rejection of more or less everybody across the political spectrum. Now, I was never particularly political growing up, and I began my career at the Morning Star. Then I worked for The Guardian for a bit, and then I went to The Telegraph. And the other cartoonists used to mock me for this, and say, well, where's next it's the Daily Mail, and then you've covered the entire spectrum. But I always found that an advantage, actually, not being particularly one side or the other. It meant that I could criticise whoever I deemed worthy of criticism on a particular day. And obviously, when you're working at a newspaper, you are told you can't cover this story for whatever reason, or don't want you to say that about this character. I was fine about that. I was never really passionate about the politics. I just liked creating funny images for people to have a chuckle about.
There's so much that is grotesque about the present President of the United States, who is surely a great gift to you as a cartoonist.
Yes, Trump is obviously a gift, although rather like Boris Johnson was, he's almost too much of a real-life cartoon. That can be difficult, actually. I think he's intentionally designed his image very carefully to be outrageous and wacky, and in the same way Boris Johnson did. And it surprises a lot of my followers now because I'm not pro-Trump, and they expect me to be.
Your image, Magadon, is a marvellous example of your art turning its fuselage against the 47th president, against Trump. Would you like to describe how those images, that particular image, came together in your mind?
I've reached the conclusion that a lot of these people are really quite evil. and the way they act in the world is wicked. And I have a book at home that's called The Infernal Dictionary. I think it was published in France in the 1800s. And it describes all of the different demons and entities people believed in, and it's full of these wonderful old woodcut etchings depicting these demons. And I just thought, well, what fun it would be to do a modern version of this and cast current political figures and create my own demonic entities and write descriptions for them. So that's going to be quite a long series. The first 3 are on display here. I expect there'll be 20 or 25 in the end.
I was reminded of Blake and William Blake's woodcuts and engravings when I first saw Magadon, and illustrations of hell by Daumier.
I did another piece that's not in this exhibition that was based on the Fall of the Rebel Angels by Bruegel, but again, all of the demons were recognisable figures being driven down by angels. I mean, that's another big change, I suppose. A lot of religious ideas, theological ideas have come into my work where they wouldn't have been there before. Of course, you probably Wouldn't expect that in newspaper cartoons anyway. You know, the great thing about being independent is I don't have to stick to the expected themes and formats of a newspaper cartoon.
Being allowed not to be on the treadmill of newspaper production every day has been a great liberation for you.
Yes, I mean it's a very tight deadline. When you work for a newspaper, you are producing for the following day's paper. You have to negotiate with the editors. Usually you only have 6 hours to produce a publishable artwork. That obviously limits the kind of ideas you can tackle. And it's been wonderful. It took me a while to adapt to this because I was so used to working at that speed. It took me a while to realise, oh, hang on, I can actually spend a few days on a piece if I want to. And I started to really expand the kind of ideas I was coming up with. And I really, like the Tony Blair image we just discussed.
Yes, how long did that take?
That took 10 days altogether. I spent a couple of days planning it, mapping it out, and then...
Pretty quick work.
It's still quick, yes. I'm still... And I will still occasionally... do them in a day, you know, if a story breaks and I think I really have to get this out by the end of today, I can still do it. And I sometimes miss the adrenaline rush because it is a thrill having to work under that pressure. But equally, I love being able to spend more time and put more detail in.
Especially in your more directly political work, it seems to me that you're very aware of the hinterland and the origins of your arts. I was thinking about the illustration of the Ship of Fools by Sebastian Brandt, which lives on in your version of it. I'm rather fond of this Ship of Fools business because it was once used by a cartoonist to illustrate the book jacket of a book that I published a few years ago. So
right.
So it's a rich
You
theme.
have a connection, yes. Yes.
So can we just look at that for a while and think about the characters in there? And it's a cove, isn't it, or COVID?
COVID, yes. That was one of those irresistible puns. Yes. And I've done a lot of work actually like that, showing all of these people in the same boat, literally in this case, but they are not. They're not really doing anything different to each other. They're all working towards the same agenda. And
who are we seeing there?
Let me just try and remember the characters. So we have Emmanuel Macron as Napoleon steering the ship at the back. Then we have, there's Jacinda Ardern is there. That was actually the first time I depicted her with her wonderful teeth.
Yes.
I do miss her in that sense. And there's Biden sitting down looking rather lost. Zelensky is in there. Who else is there? Then we have Justin Trudeau at the front.
The lockdown in Canada was really very, very harsh indeed, wasn't it?
Yes. He really went full on tyrant.
An illustration perhaps of the ease with which the superficially smooth liberal can turn into a tyrant overnight.
Yes, but it was the extraordinary thing how quickly these things were inverted. And he's a really slimy character. And of course, he styled himself as this incredibly progressive liberal, as you say.
Progressive, that much abused word.
Yes, exactly. And of course, anti-racist. And now, some people are still not aware of this, I'm discovering as they come and look around the exhibition. Of course, some years ago it emerged that Justin Trudeau had spent most of his youth, it appears, attending parties in blackface, which was obviously a great gift to someone like me who's constantly trying to point out hypocrisy. That this man who is... anti-racism has done this. But when I started depicting him in this way, I decided, well, it would be fun to just draw him always with blackface in my cartoons as a perfect illustration of how hypocritical these characters are. But people didn't necessarily know this had happened, so they would write to me saying, why have you drawn him, or who is this person, and I'd say, well, it's Justin Trudeau. I don't understand, and it was such fun being able to share the genuine photographs of him, and and then of course they would say, but I don't understand, how can you have done this, and be able to say the things that he says, Yes.
It's a great period for caricature, it seems to me, but it's also a very bleak period in the sense that there's very little real political debate about fundamentals and about freedom, and freedoms of the individual being ignored and suppressed in ways that are not really understood or appreciated. So it's a great time for you, but it's also a rather terrible time for the rest of us, perhaps.
I mean, it's been a great period for me in terms of my inspiration and motivation, and really actually understanding exactly the kind of work I wanted to produce, and I suppose aligning my values with my work. As I was saying, I'd never really been that bothered about the subjects I was covering. As soon as the madness began in 2020 with lockdowns and the whole pandemic narrative, I really felt very strongly all of a sudden that I want to push back against this, and I really want to state the moral case against these issues. And
so we have to rely on images, we have to rely on pictures, caricatures, in order to convey truths that most people find very difficult to express in words nowadays.
Yes, and that's really been made obvious to me, that the power of a single image, which if you can work out how to sum up everything in that image that people are feeling at a time, it brings them great comfort. But it was also interesting to see, as you know, there were a lot of arguments, a lot of people were divided by this, and people were very angry on both sides. They would argue for days about whether one should go and visit their parents in hospital or not, and whether to wear a mask. And I discovered that by producing these cartoons, I was sort of handing out these little grenades that people could throw into one of these arguments, and it would shut the whole thing down, because of course if you argue with a cartoon you just look rather foolish, and so I was glad I was able to provide people with that, because they would have spent days, sometimes they would have been arguing and writing back and forth, or trying to share articles and graphs and statistics. There was something about the single image that could cut through in a way that these other things weren't able to.
And cutting through, so far as your own work is concerned today, it's British, European, it's North American. What other parts of the world are sort of clocking into you?
It's extraordinary. I have people are familiar with my work all over now, which is remarkable when I think that, obviously at the Telegraph, it was basically the UK, and you wouldn't expect to be known elsewhere, but I have fans in the Philippines, lots of people in Australia, in fact, had lots of Australians coming this week, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Germany, South America, Canada, particularly places where the measures were bad. Because, unfortunately, I was one of the only people producing visual satire that opposed any of this stuff. It's sad. Every other mainstream cartoonist went along with a narrative and essentially was producing supplementary government propaganda.
Well, Bob, thank you for allowing us to enjoy your company this afternoon, and enjoying the company of your various hand grenades that surround us in this gallery. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.